Rooms that should not exist, hidden beneath what the blueprints called storage cellars. Heavy doors with locks on the outside. Ventilation shafts that suggested someone had lived down there for years. Before we dive into the story, what is the darkest case you have ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you are watching from today and what time it is right now. We are building a community of truth seekers who are not afraid of the dark. Now let's continue with the story. The Hartwell Mansion stood in Hudson Valley for 73 years before the demolition order came through. Built in 1894 by railroad owner Edmund Hartwell, it had been one of the grandest estates in Dutchess County. 3 stories of limestone and marble surrounded by carefully maintained gardens that required a staff of 12 just to take care of. Edmund died within months of its completion, leaving everything to his widow, Catherine. The demolition foreman, a man named Albert Kowalski, had torn down 14 estates in his career. He knew the architecture of wealth, understood how the rich built their homes with servants' quarters carefully separated from family spaces, root cellars for storage, and wine rooms for entertaining. What he found beneath the Hartwell estate fit none of those categories. The first strange thing appeared when his crew broke through the foundation on the eastern side. Behind what should have been a simple stone wall, they discovered a staircase going down another full story below the known basement. The stairs were well built, not the rough-hewn stone of a root cellar, but finished wood with a sturdy handrail. Someone had built this for regular use. At the bottom, a corridor stretched 30 feet lit by small ventilation shafts that opened to the surface through cleverly disguised garden ornaments. Off this corridor were 6 rooms, each roughly 10 feet square. The doors were solid oak, and each had been fitted with heavy bolt locks. The locks were on the outside. Inside the rooms, the crew found iron bed frames bolted to the floors. Remnants of curtains still hung from rods near the ventilation shafts. One room contained a broken mirror and what appeared to be a wooden chest, empty, but lined with fabric that might once have held clothing. The walls showed evidence of whitewash applied and reapplied many times, as though someone had tried repeatedly to keep the spaces fresh and clean. Near the corridor's end, they discovered a larger space fitted with a cast-iron tub and primitive plumbing connected to the house's main water system. The modifications suggested this area had been in use well into the 20th century, long after Catherine Hartwell's death in 924. Kowalski photographed everything before continuing the demolition. Something about those outward-facing locks troubled him deeply. He had torn down homes of robber barons and railroad tycoons, seen evidence of excess and cruelty in the very architecture of Gilded Age wealth. But he had never seen anything quite like this. These were not storage rooms or wine cellars, or even the grim servants' quarters common to the era. These were cells designed to keep people in, hidden away where no one above would hear or see them. The discovery prompted Albert Kowalski to contact the Hudson Valley Historical Society, who in turn brought in researchers from Columbia University. What they uncovered over the following months painted a picture that had been deliberately erased from local memory. Catherine Hartwell had employed an unusual number of young men during her 30 years as a widow. County employment records cross-reference with immigration documents at Ellis Island revealed a pattern. Between 1895 and 1923, at least 47 males between the ages of 18 and 23 had worked at the estate. Most stayed less than 6 months. Several disappeared from all records entirely after their employment ended. The researchers found something else. Hospital admission logs from Poughkeepsie General showed a cluster of former Hartwell employees seeking treatment for injuries between 1900 and 1920. The admissions notes were coded in the careful language doctors used when they suspected something they could not prove. One entry from 1903 described a 20-year-old Irishman treated for severe malnutrition and what the physician called nervous exhaustion. Another from 1911 documented fractures inconsistent with household accidents. Dr. Sarah Brennan, the Columbia historian leading the investigation, found correspondence that confirmed her growing suspicions. Letters preserved in the collections of the Irish American Historical Society contained warnings passed between immigrant communities. A 1907 letter from Sean Mallory in Poughkeepsie to his cousin in Boston was particularly revealing. Do not under any circumstance seek employment at the Hartwell place. I cannot write what I witnessed there, but I tell you truly, no amount of wages is worth what she demands. The employment pattern itself told a story. Catherine Hartwell had developed a system. She focused her recruitment efforts on recent immigrants with no family connections in America. Ship manifests showed she sometimes met incoming vessels personally, offering immediate employment to young men traveling alone. Her lawyers maintained connections with immigrant aid societies, and her name appeared on charitable organizations that helped newcomers find work. Once employed, the young men entered a world few outsiders ever saw. The main house staff consisted of women and older men who lived in the standard servants' quarters on the 3rd floor. But Catherine maintained what she called auxiliary staff for groundskeeping and heavy labor. These workers lived separately, their quarters accessible only through the main house rather than the external servants' entrance used by other employees. Payroll records showed something strange. The auxiliary staff received wages far exceeding typical compensation for manual labor, often 3 times the going rate for groundskeepers and stable hands. But bank records revealed that few of these men ever deposited their earnings. The money simply disappeared, as did many of the workers themselves. The researchers found gaps in the paper trail that suggested active concealment. Between 1900 and 1920, 17 young men were listed as having left Hartwell's employment voluntarily, yet none appeared in subsequent census records, employment registries, or immigration documents. It was as though they had evaporated. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired postal worker in Rhinebeck remembered his father mentioning something odd about mail delivery to the Hartwell estate. Catherine insisted that all correspondence be delivered directly to her, including letters addressed to servants. The postal worker's father had found this unusual enough to note it in his personal diary, which his son had preserved. In that diary, dated 1913, was a single troubling entry. Hartwell intercepted 3 letters today addressed to her groundskeeper, a young fellow named Patrick something. She pays me extra to ensure nothing reaches her staff directly. I wonder what she fears they might write or what they might read that would give them ideas about leaving. The picture emerging was one of systematic isolation. Catherine Hartwell had created an environment where young men could be cut off completely from the outside world. Their voices silenced, their movements controlled, their very existence erased from public record. The hidden rooms beneath her mansion were beginning to make terrible sense. Catherine Hartwell was not born into wealth. She was born Catherine Morland in 1868, daughter of a Philadelphia factory foreman. What elevated her was calculation, beauty, and an understanding of how power worked in Gilded Age America. She met Edmund Hartwell at a charity function where she had volunteered, catching the eye of a railroad magnate 30 years her senior. They married in 1892. Edmund was already ill, though few knew it. 2 years later he was dead and Catherine inherited everything. At 26 years old she controlled a fortune that would equal 400 million in modern currency. More importantly, she inherited the legal authority that came with it. The researchers found court records that revealed how Catherine wielded that authority. Between 1895 and 1923, she filed 42 lawsuits against former employees. Most were defamation cases, legal actions designed to silence anyone who spoke against her. The pattern was consistent. A servant would leave her employment, begin telling others about conditions at the estate, and within weeks, Catherine's lawyers would serve papers. One case from 1906 was particularly illuminating. A former groundskeeper named Thomas Brennan attempted to report his experiences to a local minister, who in turn contacted county authorities. Before any investigation could begin, Catherine sued Brennan for theft and defamation. Her lawyers presented witnesses, all current Hartwell employees, who testified that Brennan was unstable and had stolen household items. The case was dismissed, but Brennan was bankrupted by legal fees. He left New York and never spoke publicly about the estate again. Catherine's influence extended deep into local government. Financial records discovered in the Dutchess County archives showed regular payments from her accounts to township supervisors, county commissioners, and even state representatives. These were not bribes in the crude sense, but rather donations, gifts, and investments that created webs of obligation. She funded the construction of the new county courthouse in 1902. She donated generously to police benevolent associations. She sponsored the campaigns of 3 consecutive sheriffs and 2 district attorneys. When the Poughkeepsie Journal ran a series on labor conditions in 1911, Catherine placed such substantial advertising that the newspaper's editorial board discouraged further investigation into prominent local employers. Her social position provided additional insulation. Catherine hosted the most important gatherings in Hudson Valley society. Governors attended her parties. Judges dined at her table. She sat on the boards of hospitals, museums, and charitable organizations. To question Catherine Hartwell was to risk social and professional suicide. Dr. Brennan discovered something else in the court records. Catherine had successfully argued for legal guardianship over 2 of her employees, in 1908 and again in 1914. She petitioned the court claiming that young men in her service were mentally unfit to manage their own affairs. Both petitions were granted, giving her legal authority over every aspect of their lives. What happened to those 2 men after the guardianship orders remains unknown. Their names disappear from all records. The wealth gave her immunity. The social connections gave her protection. But it was the legal system itself that gave her complete control. In an era when women had limited rights in many areas, Catherine had found the mechanisms that allowed her almost absolute authority over those she employed. Property records showed she owned not just the Hudson Valley estate, but 7 other properties across New York State. Several were working farms that required staff. Several others were listed as investment properties but showed regular maintenance expenses, suggesting occupancy. The researchers began to wonder if the hidden rooms in Hudson Valley were unique, or if Catherine had created similar arrangements elsewhere. A newspaper archive in Albany contained a small article from 1917 about a fire at one of Catherine's properties in the Adirondacks. The fire was contained to what the article called auxiliary structures. No injuries were reported, but the article mentioned that local fire volunteers had been surprised to find living quarters in what property records listed as equipment storage. The building was demolished immediately after the fire, before any inspection could be completed. Catherine Hartwell had built an empire of silence, and she ruled it without oversight or accountability. The architectural evidence told a story that Catherine's lawyers and social position had successfully buried for decades. When Dr. Brennan's team examined the original building permits for the Hartwell mansion, they found something deliberately obscured. Construction began in 1893, but significant modifications were filed in 1896, 2 years after Edmund's death. The permits described the work as storage modernization and foundation reinforcement. The contractor listed was a firm from Philadelphia with no other projects in New York, a company that dissolved within a year of completing the work. The researchers located the original architectural drawings in a Philadelphia archive. What the permits called storage modernization was actually the construction of an entirely separate living space beneath the existing basement. The drawings showed meticulous planning. 6 individual chambers, each with its own ventilation shaft disguised as decorative garden elements above ground, a communal washing area with plumbing connected to the main house system, a corridor with gas lighting that could be controlled from upstairs. Most revealing was the door specification. The architect had drawn them opening outward into the corridor with bolt mechanisms accessible only from the outside. These were not storage rooms. They were designed to contain people. The ventilation system was particularly sophisticated for the era. Each shaft extended 20 feet to the surface, opening through bronze garden sculptures that Catherine had commissioned from a New York artisan. From above, they appeared to be decorative elements. From below, they provided just enough air circulation to make the underground rooms habitable for extended periods. Building supply records from Poughkeepsie lumberyards showed purchases that exceeded what the visible construction required. Catherine had ordered enough iron bed frames for 8 rooms, though the main house servants' quarters held only 12 beds total. She had purchased industrial quantities of whitewash, far more than needed for standard maintenance. The excess materials had gone somewhere, and the hidden basement provided the answer. What struck Dr. Brennan most was the location of the access point. The stairway descended from a small room off Catherine's private study on the ground floor. It was not accessible from the servants' areas or the kitchen. To reach the underground chambers, you had to pass through Catherine's personal space. She controlled every entrance and exit. The study itself still existed in photographs taken before demolition. A large desk dominated the room, positioned to face the door that led to the hidden stairway. On the wall opposite hung a portrait of Catherine, painted in 1900. She was 32 in the painting, dressed in expensive silk, her expression serene and confident. Beneath that portrait was the door to the basement chambers. Maintenance records provided additional evidence of ongoing use. Between 1896 and 1923, Catherine employed a contractor for what she termed structural upkeep. The invoices were vague but consistent. Quarterly inspections, ventilation cleaning, door maintenance, plumbing repairs. The contractor's descendants still lived in Dutchess County, and one of them had preserved his grandfather's work journal. In that journal were entries that the contractor had never submitted in his official invoices, notes about replacing damaged bed frames, observations about the need for stronger locks, a comment from 1909 that was particularly chilling. Mrs. H requests additional soundproofing for the northern chambers, installing double walls with horsehair insulation. She says the ventilation shafts carry too much noise to the gardens. The basement was not a temporary structure or an afterthought. It was purpose-built architecture designed for long-term use, constructed with privacy and control as primary concerns. Every element, from the disguised ventilation to the soundproofing to the single access point through Catherine's study, had been planned to create a space where she could exercise complete authority without observation or interference. The demolition crew had stumbled upon what amounted to a private prison built beneath one of Hudson Valley's most respected estates, operated for nearly 30 years by a woman whose wealth and social position made her untouchable. The voices of those who survived Catherine Hartwell's employment were few, but what remained painted a picture of calculated exploitation that the historical record had almost completely erased. Dr. Brennan's most significant discovery came from the archives of the Boston Catholic Archdiocese. A letter dated 1903 written by a man named James Doherty to his brother Michael in South Boston. The letter had been preserved because Michael had given it to his priest hoping the church might intervene. It never did, but the priest had filed it away with other correspondence deemed too sensitive to discard. I am writing to warn you against accepting any position in the Hudson Valley, particularly from a woman of means named Hartwell, James wrote. What she requires of those in her service goes beyond any labor man should perform. I cannot detail the nature of it in writing for fear this letter might be intercepted, but I tell you plainly that no wage justifies the degradation. She treats men as property, not as servants. I have seen things that would make you weep for what we endure in this country. The letter ended with a plea: do not come to New York. Stay in Boston, where there are proper Irish societies and churches to protect you. Here, there is no one who will listen, and those who try to speak are destroyed. Another fragment came from a deposition taken in 1912 during an unrelated civil case. A physician named Dr. Harold Westfield was being questioned about his treatment of workers from various estates. The opposing attorney had asked whether he had noticed any patterns in injuries or ailments among employees from specific households. Dr. Westfield's response was carefully worded but revealing. I have treated several young men formerly employed at the Hartwell estate. The conditions I observed were consistent with prolonged confinement and severe psychological distress. These were not injuries from normal household work or grounds maintenance. When I attempted to inquire further, the patients became fearful and refused to provide details. One stated explicitly that he feared legal retaliation if he spoke honestly about his employment. The deposition noted that Dr. Westfield had reported his concerns to county health authorities in 1909. No record of any subsequent investigation exists. Perhaps most haunting was a diary discovered in a Rhode Island estate sale in 1971. The diary had belonged to Father Timothy O'Brien, an Irish priest who served parishes throughout New York State between 1900 and 1930. His entries from 1918 included observations about confession that clearly troubled him. Another young man from the Hartwell place came to confession today, Father O'Brien wrote. This is the third in 2 years. What they describe is beyond my capacity to understand, yet consistent enough that I cannot dismiss it as delusion or exaggeration. She has built something unholy there, a system of domination that inverts every natural order. These men speak of being kept like animals, of degradations they cannot name in detail, even to a priest. They describe complete control over their lives, their movements, their very bodies treated as her possessions to use as she wishes. The entry continued. I have written to Bishop Sullivan requesting guidance on whether I should report these confessions to civil authorities. The bishop has not replied. I fear the Hartwell woman's influence extends even into the church. Her donations built the new rectory in Poughkeepsie. Who will move against such a benefactor on the word of immigrant laborers with no standing in society? There was no record that Father O'Brien ever received a response, or that he took any action beyond preserving his troubled thoughts in private writing. These fragments, scattered across different archives and surviving only by chance, all pointed to the same reality. Catherine Hartwell had created a system where young men could be exploited with impunity, where their testimony carried no weight against her wealth and position, where even those who wanted to help them found themselves powerless to act. The system Catherine built relied on identifying the most vulnerable, those with the least ability to resist or escape. Her recruitment strategy revealed a predator's understanding of isolation and dependency. Immigration records from Ellis Island showed a pattern that became clear only when examined across 2 decades. Catherine maintained relationships with immigrant aid workers at the docks, paying them to identify young men arriving alone. She specifically sought those from remote Irish villages or Italian provinces, men whose families could not afford passage to America and who had no network waiting for them. A ledger discovered in the New York Immigration Aid Society archives detailed the arrangements. Between 1900 and 1920, Catherine paid finder's fees for references to 23 specific individuals. The notations beside each name were revealing. No family in America illiterate in English from County Clare, no contacts traveling alone from Sicily. She met several of these men personally at the docks, offering immediate employment at wages that seemed generous. Room and board included, she promised, with opportunities for advancement. To men who had just endured weeks in steerage with uncertain prospects, the offer appeared to be extraordinary luck. Once at the estate, the isolation became total. Catherine's household operated under strict rules. The auxiliary staff, as she called them, were forbidden from leaving the property without her explicit permission. Their wages were held in trust, Catherine explained, to ensure they saved money rather than wasting it on drink or gambling. She would manage their funds, she assured them, providing everything they needed. Mail service, as the postal worker's diary had noted, was completely controlled. Letters sent to the auxiliary staff never reached them. Letters they attempted to send were intercepted. One former employee, in testimony that surfaced years later, described writing to his mother in Ireland only to have Catherine confront him with the letter. She had told him his mother did not need to worry about him, that his success in America should be demonstrated through savings, not correspondence. She destroyed the letter in front of him. The main house staff, the women and older men who lived in traditional servants' quarters, were kept entirely separate from the auxiliary workers. Catherine enforced this separation through both physical architecture and explicit rules. The two groups used different entrances, ate at different times, and were forbidden from speaking to one another. Several former housemaids interviewed decades later said they had been aware that young men worked on the grounds, but had rarely seen them and never spoken with them. This separation served multiple purposes. It prevented the auxiliary staff from forming alliances or sharing information with others who might help them. It also meant that the regular household employees, who had some contact with the outside world, knew almost nothing about what occurred in the hidden chambers beneath the estate. Bank records revealed another element of control. The wages Catherine promised were indeed paid, at least on paper. Account ledgers showed regular deposits made in the names of her auxiliary staff, but signature cards for those accounts showed Catherine as the sole authorized user. The men whose names appeared on the accounts never actually accessed their own money. When workers did leave, either through escape or dismissal, they departed with nothing. No savings, despite months or years of labor. No references, as Catherine's lawyers would threaten legal action against anyone who attempted to vouch for former employees. No documentation proving they had even worked at the estate, as Catherine kept all employment records private. A few tried to fight back through legal channels. Court records from 1909 showed a young man named Giovanni Rossi attempting to sue for unpaid wages. Catherine's attorneys produced signed agreements witnessed by her personal staff, showing Rossi had been compensated in full, and had even signed documents acknowledging satisfaction with his treatment. The case was dismissed. Rossi left New York and was never heard from again. Catherine had created a perfect trap, and she refined it over decades of practice. 3 times, men who escaped Catherine Hartwell's employment tried to expose what happened behind the walls of her estate. 3 times, the system she had built crushed those attempts before they could gain traction. The first documented case came in 1907. Two former workers, Patrick Corrigan and Daniel Murphy, both Irish immigrants in their early 20s, filed a complaint with the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty. Though both were adults, they argued that the conditions they had endured constituted a form of bondage that required intervention. Their complaint described systematic confinement, forced labor under threat, and treatment that violated their dignity as human beings. They claimed Catherine had kept them in the underground chambers for months at a time, controlling every aspect of their existence. Their testimony was specific and consistent. Catherine's response was immediate and overwhelming. Her attorneys produced 15 witnesses, all current or former Hartwell employees, who testified that Corrigan and Murphy were disgruntled workers spreading malicious lies. They presented signed contracts showing both men had agreed to their terms of employment. They produced financial records indicating both had been paid generously and had left of their own accord. More damaging were character witnesses from prominent citizens. A county judge testified that Catherine Hartwell was beyond reproach, a pillar of the community whose charitable work spoke to her moral character. A Presbyterian minister described her as devout and generous. 3 business leaders praised her integrity. The society dismissed the complaint within 2 weeks. Corrigan and Murphy found themselves facing defamation charges. Neither could afford legal representation. Both left New York shortly after. Murphy's name appeared in Boston police records 2 years later, arrested for vagrancy. Corrigan vanished completely from all documentation. The second attempt came in 1914 when a reform-minded district attorney named Charles Whitmore took office in Dutchess County. Whitmore had campaigned on cleaning up corruption and protecting workers' rights. He had heard rumors about the Hartwell estate and decided to investigate. His inquiry began with interviewing former employees. He managed to locate 4 men willing to provide testimony about their experiences. Their accounts were disturbing and consistent, describing a system of exploitation that went far beyond harsh working conditions. They spoke of being treated as possessions, subjected to humiliations designed to break their will, kept in conditions that denied them basic autonomy. Whitmore prepared to bring charges, but before he could file, 3 of his 4 witnesses recanted their statements. Each claimed they had misunderstood the questions, that their English had been poor, that they had been confused. The 4th witness, a man named Antonio Biano, disappeared 2 days before he was scheduled to give formal testimony. An investigation into Whitmore's office revealed that one of his assistant prosecutors had financial connections to Catherine's legal team. Documents had been shared before charges could be filed. Catherine knew exactly what evidence Whitmore possessed and who his witnesses were. Whitmore's political opponents, many of whom had received Catherine's financial support, began investigating him for misconduct. Within 6 months, he resigned his position and left New York. The investigation into the Hartwell estate died with his departure. The final documented attempt came in 1918 through ecclesiastical rather than civil channels. Father O'Brien, troubled by what he had heard in confession, wrote a detailed letter to his bishop outlining his concerns. He did not break the seal of confession, but described patterns he had observed, multiple testimonies that suggested systematic abuse of power. The bishop's response, discovered years later in diocese archives, was brief and pointed. Catherine Hartwell had recently pledged $50,000 toward building a new Catholic hospital in Poughkeepsie. The bishop advised Father O'Brien to focus on spiritual rather than temporal matters, reminding him that accusations against prominent parishioners required extraordinary evidence. Father O'Brien made no further attempts to intervene. His diary entries from late 1918 showed his despair. "I have failed these men. The institution of the Church, which should protect the vulnerable, instead protects its benefactors. I am ashamed of my silence. Yet I see no path forward that would not result in my removal and the continuation of evil, without even the small comfort of confession these poor souls currently receive." Every system designed to protect the exploited had failed when confronted with Catherine's wealth and influence. The evidence of what actually occurred in those basement chambers came from sources Catherine never anticipated would survive. Medical records, veterinary invoices, and fragments of testimony painted a picture of exploitation that inverted every expected dynamic of power in Gilded Age society. Hospital admission records from Poughkeepsie General between 1900 and 1920 showed a pattern the attending physicians had documented but never fully understood. Young men presenting with conditions that suggested prolonged stress and psychological trauma. Physical examinations noted signs consistent with sustained periods of confinement. Several cases included injuries that the examining doctors found inconsistent with the manual labor these men supposedly performed. One physician's notes from 1911 were particularly detailed. A patient identified only as JM presented with severe malnutrition and what the doctor termed nervous exhaustion. The examination revealed evidence of long-term physical stress. When questioned about his employment, the patient became agitated and refused to provide details. The physician noted, patient displays extreme fear of his former employer. Physical condition suggests treatment more appropriate to livestock than human servants. Unable to determine full extent of situation due to patient's terror of legal consequences. The veterinary records provided another disturbing piece of the puzzle. Dr. Brennan's team discovered invoice books from a veterinarian named Robert Hastings, who served the Hartwell estate from 1902 through 1919. Among routine entries for horse care and farm animals were notations that seemed out of place. Multiple entries referenced training sessions for Catherine's dogs, specifically related to what Hastings called behavioral conditioning. Several invoices mentioned consultations about animal behavior in domestic settings. One entry from 1907 stated Mrs. H requests guidance on historical practices regarding animal presence during household activities, provided references to medieval customs as requested. Another entry from 1913 was more explicit. Consultation regarding dogs in proximity to human subjects. Advised on safety protocols. Miss H insists on authenticity to historical practices. I have reservations about this application, but she is insistent and compensates well. Legal depositions from unrelated cases contained fragments that corroborated the disturbing picture. In 1916, during a property dispute, a surveyor testified about his work at the Hartwell estate. He mentioned hearing sounds from below ground that troubled him, describing them as consistent with human distress. When pressed, he stated he had reported his concerns to the estate manager, who told him certain areas were off limits and he should focus on his contracted work. A deposition from 1920 involved a supplier who had delivered goods to the estate for years. Under questioning about business practices, he mentioned that Catherine required deliveries of items unusual for a household. Heavy leather restraints that she claimed were for training horses, quantities of chain that exceeded any agricultural need, specialized locks and bolts far beyond normal security requirements. The most chilling evidence came from a private journal kept by Catherine's personal physician, Dr. Marcus Fleming. The journal was not discovered until 1983, found in his grandson's attic. Fleming had treated Catherine from 1905 until her death, and his private writings revealed knowledge he had never shared publicly. A 1912 entry read, "Catherine suffers from no illness I can identify, yet she summons me quarterly to examine her health. I believe these visits serve another purpose. She wishes me to see that she remains robust and capable. Today she made peculiar statements about the nature of power, how it resides not in wealth alone, but in the ability to exercise complete dominion. She spoke of ancient Roman practices, of how the powerful once treated others as mere objects for their pleasure and use. Her tone suggested not historical interest, but personal philosophy." Another entry from 1917 was more direct. "I have seen the quarters where she keeps her auxiliary staff. What I observe there troubles me greatly. These men live in conditions designed to strip dignity and enforce absolute submission. The arrangements speak to appetites that society would find incomprehensible, a reversal of natural order that she justifies through wealth and position. I am complicit through my silence. Yet, what authority would believe such accusations against a woman of her standing?" Dr. Fleming never reported what he had witnessed. He died in 1934, his journal hidden away, another voice silenced by the social impossibility of imagining a wealthy woman as a predator. Catherine Hartwell died on February 12, 1924, at the age of 56. Her death certificate listed heart failure as the cause. Within hours of her death, her executors began systematically destroying evidence of how she had lived. Her will, filed with the Dutchess County Probate Court, contained unusual provisions. Several pages were sealed by court order at the request of her attorneys, citing privacy concerns for surviving family members. Catherine had no surviving family. The sealed pages remained closed for 50 years, and when they were finally opened in 1974, most of the text had been deliberately rendered illegible with ink. What could be read was revealing enough. Catherine had established a trust fund of $20,000 to be divided among 5 men identified only by initials. The payment was contingent on their signing comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. The will specified that these agreements covered all aspects of their employment at the estate and any knowledge they possessed of household operations. 3 of the 5 men claimed their payments. 2 never came forward, their fates unknown. The 3 who did accept the money were required to sign documents, copies of which survived in the probate file. The language was sweeping. They agreed never to discuss, write about, or testify regarding any aspect of their time at the Hartwell estate. Violation would result in immediate legal action and repayment of all funds plus damages. The will also contained specific instructions for the disposal of Catherine's personal effects. All papers, journals, and correspondence were to be burned without examination. Her personal attorney, a man named Theodore Ashworth, was given explicit authority to destroy any materials he deemed sensitive. Ashworth carried out these instructions thoroughly. Estate sale records showed that a bonfire burned for 3 days on the Hartwell property in March of 1924. Witnesses described boxes of papers being fed into the flames. One observer, a neighbor named Ellen Pritchett, later wrote in her diary that she had watched the smoke rising and wondered what secrets were being erased. She noted that Ashworth personally supervised the burning, ensuring nothing was removed or saved. The underground chambers received special attention. Before the estate could be sold, Catherine's will require that specific portions of the basement be sealed and filled with concrete. Her executors hired a construction crew from Pennsylvania, men who had no connection to the local community. They worked quickly, pouring concrete into the chambers until they were completely filled. Building permits for this work described it as foundation stabilization. The permits were approved without inspection, rushed through by county officials who had benefited from Catherine's patronage for years. By April of 1924, the basement chambers were entombed beneath tons of concrete. The estate itself was sold later that year to a manufacturing concern that planned to subdivide the property. The new owners found the house too expensive to maintain and began using it for storage. By 1930, it stood empty. By 1940, it was abandoned. During those years, rumors circulated in the local community. Former servants who had worked in the main house, who had never been part of Catherine's inner circle, began speaking more freely after her death. They described strange sounds they had sometimes heard at night, the way Catherine would disappear for hours into her study, the auxiliary staff, who were never seen but whose presence was known. One former housemaid interviewed by a local historian in 1958 remembered something specific. She had been cleaning Catherine's study one morning in 1920 and had noticed scratches on the floor near the door that led to the basement. Deep marks in the wood as though something heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly. When she had asked about them, Catherine had told her never to enter that study again. The housemaid was reassigned to other areas of the house. The most damning evidence of the cover-up came from Catherine's financial records, which her executors could not completely destroy due to tax requirements. In the final year of her life, she had made substantial payments to 7 different attorneys across 3 states. The payment descriptions were vague, but the amounts were enormous. Legal experts who examined the records decades later concluded these were likely payments to silence potential witnesses or to prepare legal defenses against possible future accusations. Catherine Hartwell died wealthy, respected, and protected by the system she had manipulated for 3 decades. The truth of what she had done was buried as thoroughly as the chambers beneath her mansion. The demolition of the Hartwell mansion in 1967 finally brought evidence to light that Catherine's executors could not destroy. But understanding why this history remained buried for so long reveals something darker about how power operates and whose suffering gets remembered. When Albert Kowalski's photographs reached Columbia University, they sparked immediate academic interest. Dr. Brennan assembled a team that spent 3 years investigating. Their findings were published in 1971 in the Journal of American Social History. The article received modest attention in academic circles but never reached popular awareness. Why the silence? The answer lay in multiple intersecting factors. First was the nature of the victims. Young immigrant men, working class, with no families to advocate for them, left few traces in the historical record, unlike crimes against women and children, which by the 1970s were receiving increased attention. Abuse of adult males was barely acknowledged as possible, particularly when the perpetrator was a woman. Second was the challenge of evidence. Catherine had destroyed so much, and what remained was fragmentary. Historians could build a compelling circumstantial case, but definitive proof of specific acts was limited. Academic caution prevented stronger claims, and media outlets showed little interest in a story that could not be told with certainty. Third was the uncomfortable reality of gender. American society in the 1970s was beginning to reckon with male violence against women, a necessary and overdue conversation. But a case of a wealthy woman systematically exploiting men did not fit emerging narratives about power and gender. It was easier to ignore than to integrate into developing frameworks of understanding abuse. The few men who could be identified and located decades later were elderly, many suffering from the psychological consequences of their experiences. Most refused to speak publicly. The stigma attached to male victims was overwhelming. Several who were approached by researchers declined interviews, stating they wanted to forget that chapter of their lives entirely. One man interviewed anonymously in 1973 provided the most direct testimony ever recorded. He had worked at the Hartwell estate in 1921 when he was 19 years old. He spent 8 months there before escaping. His account, though carefully sanitized for publication, described systematic dehumanization designed to strip away any sense of autonomy or dignity. She told us we were hers, he said. Not employed by her, but hers. Like animals or furniture. She did things that made us understand we had no rights, no humanity in her eyes. We were there for her use, however she wished, and there was nowhere to go. No one who would believe us if we spoke. Who would believe that a fine lady treated men worse than livestock? He described the isolation, the control, the way Catherine had structured every element of the system to ensure compliance. He spoke of watching other men break under the pressure, some becoming entirely passive, others developing psychological problems that followed them for life. He himself had never fully recovered, spending years homeless before finally finding stability in his 40s. The historical record now acknowledges Catherine Hartwell's crimes, at least in academic circles, but she remains largely unknown outside scholarly work on Gilded Age exploitation. No popular books have been written about her, no documentaries produced. The few attempts to bring her story to broader attention have been met with discomfort and skepticism. This case reveals how thoroughly wealth and social position can insulate someone from consequences, how institutional structures can fail the vulnerable, and how society's assumptions about gender can render certain victims invisible. Catherine Hartwell built an empire of abuse that operated openly for 3 decades because no one could imagine a wealthy woman as a predator, and no one valued the testimony of immigrant workers enough to investigate their claims. The men who suffered in those basement chambers are gone now, their names mostly forgotten, their voices silenced by time, shame, and systemic indifference. What remains is a cautionary tale about power unchecked, suffering ignored, and the victims that history chooses to forget. If this story disturbed you, it should. It is a reminder that evil does not always look the way we expect and that justice delayed is often justice denied. Hit that like button if you believe these forgotten stories need to be told. Subscribe if you want to keep diving into the history they tried to bury. Because the darkest chapters are always the ones someone worked hardest to erase.